Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, August 19th, 2025, and our friend Carl Wilkerson is back with us. Welcome back, Larry.
Good to be with you, Nima. I always want to see your new shirt.
I'm waiting for your.
Well, I've got an order in.
Yeah, but you're going to join us on Friday.
Maybe we'll have them by then because I sent all the way to Oahu, but some time ago, so should be arriving.
Yeah. Let me start, Larry, with the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
Oh my goodness, you wouldn't want to start there.
Yeah. But what's your take on what has happened? Do you feel positive about what has happened? Do you feel somehow in the middle, negative, positive, in the middle? Because you look at the Russian part, it's positive. On the part of the United States, many mainstream media is just destroying Donald Trump. I don't know why they're doing this, but and Donald Trump himself, it seems that somehow positive. Your take on that? What has happened, and what's your take on that?
First of all, the mainstream media is a shill for the empire. There's no question about that. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, a number of others, and the media that goes along with it, the visual media like MSNBC, CNN, and so forth. But they have to be very careful now because they're walking a fine line. They are usually shills par excellence when the Democrats are in power because most of their leadership is predisposed to people like Chuck Schumer and others like him, Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, and so forth. Now, they're in sort of a dilemma now as to how they report. They're still a shill for the empire, but they don't know what the empire means anymore with Donald Trump in there. And I think they are viscerally opposed to Trump, most of them anyway. Not all of them, but most of them. So that colors everything, especially for someone like you looking into the empire from the outside. This meeting, I think that, every now and then I will look at the New York Times. I will look at the online version in particular because it comes in on my phone every day. Usually I just delete it. But this morning I saw a sentence that developed well, and so I read it, and it summed it up really. It said, with respect to the meeting in Alaska, Europeans who were on vacation, who were indisposed otherwise, who probably normally don't pick up and run when someone calls, suddenly did so. And why did they did so? Because, and here comes the real jewel, because they knew that the last person to get to Trump usually got to Trump. The last person he hears from is who he follows. And so they rushed here. Interestingly, the polls did not. That's something to footnote we could talk about later if you like, but they did not. And I know from inside sources, I think reliable, that it was a considered decision not to come. That tells you something about one of the most important countries in this Ukraine business, if it is to be resolved ultimately. Then the second point I would make about it is that you really don't understand what happened in Alaska other than, concretely, other than there will be no ceasefire. I think that is probably ironclad. Even though the Europeans apparently talked about it still, and Zelensky talked about it still, there will be none. And Trump is probably, he's adamant about that, I think. And I think that goes to Putin, giving him essentially insight into why a country in a war that has cost much blood and treasure, that is winning and winning resoundingly, does not want a ceasefire. And while one that is losing and losing really badly wants a ceasefire, particularly, and I'm sure Putin delivered this message, particularly if that power that's losing is backed by duplicitous sons of bitches like Europe, NATO, and the United States, because they've been cheated innumerable times over the past, not just 5 or 6 years, but the past 20 years with regard to NATO's expansion and such. And they're not going to be cheated anymore. They're going to, the poker game's going to be on the table and all the cards are going to be up. All the money's already bet. So that came, and then the idea of security guarantees. I think we got a little bit from both meetings, the Europeans, Zelensky, and Alaska. We got a little bit of insight into what security guarantees might mean. Putin apparently said something about being willing to accept certain security guarantees. If that's true and reliable, I know what he's talking about. I think he's talking about other than NATO powers, other than Western powers. Let's say, for example, Indian forces. Let's say, for example, Chinese forces that might eventually be commissioned by the United Nations, I would assume, to patrol a line that might be established. Don't call it a DMZ, but call it a buffer zone between the two parties. And let's examine really quickly, and Trump, I think, got some inkling of this too from Putin, why that's necessary. It's not necessary because of the Russians, because they've got what they want. They have won, period. It's necessary because of the Ukrainians and because of the people who back the Ukrainians, NATO, Europe in general, and Washington, particularly London too. They will start something in a heartbeat, especially those people who control Zelensky. And I'm talking about the Nazis. I'm talking about the real Nazis that control Zelensky inside Kyiv. They will start something immediately, and Russia will have nothing but problems along that line for the rest of eternity if it goes on that long. And every prospect could show, or might show that it will, especially if we don't back off. If we don't back off in Azerbaijan and Georgia and other places, it's going to continue, and it's going to simmer and rise and fall, and simmer and rise and fall. So I understand why Putin would say what he said, allegedly, about security guarantees, but they got to be special kind of security guarantees. No NATO, no Western forces at all. And I understand maybe even about swaps, because by the time this is done and we get to the point where there is a peace agreement and a buffer zone going up, Putin's going to own a lot of territory he might not necessarily want. And so there's going to be some swapping around. And probably, the Donbass, I think, is sanctified. That is it. I mean, we're talking about those 4 oblasts, of which the Donbass is 2. That's done. That's a done deal. And interestingly, I read a paper the other day about how Kosovo relates to that, if you think about it for a moment. And the paper, just very, very uncomplex, straightforward paragraph, essentially said, and I think it was written by a jurist, a guy from Switzerland, I believe, a diplomatic lawyer, that if the Albanian Kosovars could say that they didn't want to be under Belgrade, why the hell can't the Russians in the Donbass say they don't want to be under Kyiv? I mean, it's good for the goose is good for the gander. And of course, that's been a thorn in Putin's side ever since Putin took over, and we declared Kosovo, and Putin didn't like that. I mean, he's never recognized Kosovo. So there's a lot that came out of Alaska that might give a little bit, a modicum of hope. And then there's the meeting in the White House with Zelensky and the Europeans, which gives diminishment to that hope. And then there's the mercurial and vacuous nature of Donald J. Trump. And you wonder what he's going to say tomorrow or what he's going to do tomorrow.
Larry, I don't know if you saw the video that the German chancellor is talking about the ceasefire, and you look at the face of the expression on the face of Meloni, that you, oh my God, he's talking about it again.
I didn't see that. Play it if you got it.
I don't have it.
It
was amazing to see that Meloni reacting to what Merz was talking about, the ceasefire. And it seems that within the Europeans, among European leaders, you don't see that sort of unity. They don't feel the same way.
No, there's different opinions across the board. And I think one of the most important countries in this whole thing is Poland. And I think I was talking with a Pole this morning about how to pronounce it. I think Narachki, I think is the way he says it's supposed to be pronounced, the new president. I think he is showing some different colors from the other Polish leaders and from perhaps the more virulent and dogmatic Poles about Russia. I think he understands viscerally that you do not want to make of Russia an enemy. And you've got to find a way out of this morass that they've been drug into by NATO. He's not going to say that outright because sentiment in Poland is still a little wishy-washy, political sentiment in particular. But I think we've got a new leader there. And that may change a lot of the dynamics because, as Doug McGregor said yesterday, look at the countries right around Ukraine. And ain't none of those countries that we essentially like to deal with. If you want to put, not to put too fine a point on it, but you got Romania, you got Hungary, you got Poland, of course. Doug even said Lithuania, I think, but I don't think Lithuania has a border with Ukraine. It's Belarusia, and Lithuania is just kind of tucked in there, but without a border. But those countries are important, and what those countries feel about Russia being a threat to them is quite different in many respects from what the rest of NATO pretends to feel about Russia being a threat to them. So let's gravitate towards them a little bit, and let's see what's happening there and how they might be able to help with what we're eventually going to have to do, because they're on the front line, so to speak. They may have a little rump state of Ukraine between them and Russia right now, but they're on the front lines. And if you consider Belarusia, they're really on the front lines. So let's listen to what they have to say. And I think what they have to say increasingly is going to be settle this and settle it now. And to hell with NATO if it has to be that way.
Larry, you mentioned Poland and the behavior that we're witnessing from them. How do you see the way that they're behaving? You remember when the conflict started in Ukraine, they were the most hawkish.
And U.S. forces on their borders, and Poland was the place receiving point for U.S. military.
What's happening? And they're not right now in the front line, in my opinion.
No, I think
do you think that they're thinking of capturing and having some part of Ukraine?
I did for a while there, and I never discount that for a certain segment of the Polish people and political structure. But I think right now the substantive changing thought, if you will, is about not making an enemy out of Russia. And certainly not making an enemy out of Russia in order to grease up your relationship with the EU, which is a bit tentative, especially with people like van der Leyen in there. They are beginning to understand that the EU is not in any way, fashion, or form a democratic institution. It's authoritarian as anything else you want to look at in the world, certainly as authoritarian as China is. In trade policy, economic policy in general, security policy, I'm sorry. These people are a force within themselves and not a positive force. So I think Poland realizes its history, if you will. And some of that history is interpreted by the right wing, if you will, as being indicative of we have to stand up to Moscow no matter what. Otherwise, they'll come take us and ruin us again, blah, 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 blah. And then the others are more realist. And they're thinking in terms of where we are, what our history suggests about where we are, where we might be in the future, especially if this conflict continues. And, oh, by the way, we really don't want that land that's in there that people say we want, because we'd have the same problem that Russia will have if it had it. There'll be these horrible partisans sniping at us and killing us for the rest of eternity. Ukrainians are just, they are, there's a certain segment of them that the Azov battalion exemplifies that just doesn't know how to do anything but fight. go to the woods and fight and rob anybody that comes along in the process and rape any women that come along in the process. I'm sorry, that's the history of that region. So I think Poland is important to this ultimate settlement, and I think I'm seeing signs of their becoming very rational about it and very realistic about it. I hope. I may be wrong. I hope that's the truth. And there's other countries too that are showing that. And then there's some that have shown it all along. No matter what we think of Viktor Orban in Hungary, Hungary has shown don't like his support of Israel, don't like it at all, don't like anybody's support of Israel. How anyone in the world, particularly a political leader, could support Bibi Netanyahu is beyond me, utterly beyond me. But his other positions have been fairly smart. Had we gotten, what was the gentleman's name that actually won the first part of the election in Romania? Had we gotten him in there, I think we'd had a Romanian government that would have been different too. I don't know how this current government's going to fold out because they seem to be learning a few things too. Just like the party in Georgia that won, barely, but won. And now we're trying to overthrow because we don't want them in there. They believe in a balanced policy between Moscow and Brussels and Washington. And the party we want in there, we want to believe in defying Russia. We should be able to see what that got us before. And more importantly, what it got Georgians before. They lost South Ossetia and Abkhazia for all practical purposes. So it's got to calm down a little bit. And mainly it's got to calm down because, and I think they talked about this in Alaska. I hope they did. I can't believe Putin didn't talk about this. It's got to settle down a little bit so we can get a handle on a bigger challenge. And that is nuclear weapons and a new security architecture for that part of the world, which hopefully would include Russia. Although I think it'll be a while before that happens.
Larry, here is what Marco Rubio said about the meeting.
Did you hear what he did about visas and visits for Palestinian wounded children? Children who've been wounded badly, they can't come to the United States anymore. I have no truck for Marco Rubio anymore. He can go to hell as far as I'm concerned. Can you imagine telling wounded children who have no other place to go for specialized surgery and things like that, for example, that they can't come to the United States? I'd like to have that bastard out in the street with a rock in my hand.
Yeah.
Sorry, just had to get that out.
I started to learn about it. I didn't know it, Larry.
Precedented, really, when you think about all these European leaders came here, 7 that were there and that included the head of NATO and the head of the EU. And they all said the same thing, which is this, after 3 years of sort of deadlock and no talks and no change in circumstances, this is the first time where there seems to be some movement. Now, look, this is a complicated war. There's no doubt about it. I mean, this has been going on for 3.5 years. A lot of people have died. A lot of territories exchanged back and forth. So it's not an easy thing to unwind. But nothing was happening on this war. Literally, the only option that we were given under the previous administration was continue to fund Ukraine for however much they need, for however long it takes. And now you have people actually talking about pathways towards ending it. Now, it's going to take a little bit more work and a little bit more time, but we are making progress. It's not me saying it. That is virtually every leader there today said that in front of the cameras. And they're saying it for a reason, because it's true and they're witnessing it and they've been a part of it.
So these European nations, and some of these are NATO countries, are they willing to put troops on the ground in Ukraine to cement this peace deal? Would that make Ukraine kind of like a NATO ally?
Well, what's being contemplated, look, any sovereign country in the world has a right to enter into security alliances with other countries. It's not just NATO. We have such alliances with South Korea. We have it with Japan. Other countries have it with each other. And so I think everyone would acknowledge, including, by the way, for the first time, the Russian side, under President Trump's sort of pressure or, a suggestion, is that, in fact, a Ukraine post-conflict has a right to enter into security agreements with other countries. And we will work with our European allies and non-European countries, by the way, to build such a security guarantee. We're working on that right now. We'll continue to work on that. And that'll be something that'll have to be in place after a peace deal, so that, Ukraine can feel safe moving forward. And we're coordinating that as we speak. We're involved in the coordination of it. So yeah, there are a number of countries that are willing to step forward and provide Ukraine security guarantees. But as the Ukrainians have said to us, and I think have said publicly, the strongest security guarantee they can come up with their future is to have a strong military moving forward. And that's the other dynamic that's changed. We're no longer giving Ukraine weapons. We're no longer giving Ukraine money. We are now selling them weapons, and European countries are paying for it through NATO. They are using NATO to buy the weapons and transfer them to Ukraine. That's another big change from the way this war was approached.
Listen to how stupid he is. And I did not say unwise. Unwise means he might have some smarts, he's just using them badly. I said stupid. That means he may have some wisdom, but he's using it for absolutely the wrong purposes. And I don't even think he's that. I really think he's, shall I say it, dumb. I never thought I'd say that. I dislike Marco Rubio viscerally, always have. But as Ricardo Alarcón said, he's a Cuban after all. But that was really stupid. I wrote down 3 things that he said. Complicated? Complicated? Are you stupid to the fairly well, Mr. Rubio? This isn't complicated at all. Putin's been uncomplicating it for you for 2-3 years, ever since you screwed up Istanbul with Boris Johnson. He's been uncomplicating it for you. I'm sorry. That is the truth, and you're lying through your teeth, or you're stupider than hell. Second, right to enter a security agreement? Marco, baby, tell me how you would react. Tell me how your president would react. Tell me how Secretary Hegseth would react if all of a sudden China entered into a security agreement with Mexico, or vice versa, and China moved major military forces to Chihuahua. Tell me how you would react if Russia entered into a pact with Canada, not so far-fetched these days, and put military force on our northern border. You would say then that any country has a right to enter into an alliance, military, security, whatever you want to call it, with any other country that it wants to? Marco, you're an idiot. You expect the people listening to you to be an idiot. And then lastly, security guarantees and a strong military. Marco, you didn't hear what happened in Alaska. Your president didn't debrief you rightly. The security guarantees, as I've said, cannot be any Western forces, period. And they cannot be certainly a revamped, revitalized, thoroughly supplied, logistic, and everything else Ukrainian military. It simply can't be, because all Putin will look at that is another delay, another Minsk, another 3 years, 4 years, Ukraine will be right back on the battlefield again. And the United States will have built up its repertoire, and so will Europe, and they'll be right back at the same thing again. I'm sorry, Rubio, you're an idiot.
He said that some countries want to put troops on the ground in Ukraine. And here is, when we talk about those countries, here is that shows who's willing to do that.
You got the Article 5 protections, though, for Ukraine. So they're not going to be a part of NATO, but you still got them the same protection.
We're not, so they're not going to be a part of NATO, but we've got the European nations, and they'll front load it, and they'll have some of them, France and Germany, a couple of them, UK. They want to have boots on the ground. Not in. I don't think it's going to be a problem, to be honest with you. I think Putin is tired of it. I think they're all tired of it. But you never know. We're going to find out about President Putin in the next couple of weeks. That I can tell you, and we're going to see where it all goes.
But you never know. You never know unless you listen to Putin. Donald, you didn't listen, Donald.
What does that mean, putting troops? French.
Germany couldn't muster a brigade. England could maybe. Great Britain could maybe muster a brigade and supply it for 6 months. The French, maybe they could muster a couple. But they're not going to need to muster anything because Putin will never accept a NATO member putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. That's entering the war. However, post-conflict, they might suggest it is, that's NATO entering the war. He's been categorically clear about that. You can't do that. So, Donald, what are you talking about? Why are you mussing things up? Why are you making a relatively clear situation, which I hope you came away with a great appreciation of from Alaska? Why are you making it so murky? Well, I know why he's making it murky, because he's got to deal with all these nasty people around him. But don't make it murky in a way that you find later it extremely difficult to walk back, because you are not going to get anything out of Putin that Putin hasn't declared he will give you. And that's just the reality of it. Look how stupid this is, though, really. NATO is falling apart. There's no question about that. It's collapsing. It's collapsing of its own stupidity. The people in NATO countries are going to vote sometime in the next 6 to 18 months, maybe 24 with the case of a couple of the countries. And they're going to vote the current governments out. I don't think there's going to be a single exception to that. When they vote those governments out, they're going to partly be voting them out because they made such a mess of this. Then where is Europe going to be? That's a huge question in my mind. Is there going to be any possibility of preserving what I call the transatlantic link? That is to say, some kind of decent security relationship between Washington and Europe. Because there's not going to be any NATO anymore. There is not going to be any NATO anymore. I don't know how he's planning on dealing with that, Trump, I mean, because I hear no evidence whatsoever of his having, or his people having, any kind of long-term strategy about that. Nima, they have a better defined, even if I might not find it palatable, domestic strategy for picking up immigrants, for doing all kinds of nefarious things with ICE, for training and recruiting military personnel who might be more conducive to a coup d'etat, should they want to, carry one out, to even policing the Capitol in a way that makes me think they're preparing the grounds for that coup, which they didn't do on January the 6th. I've said many times that coup did not fail because the system held. It failed because they were incompetent. They will not be incompetent again. Whether I'm talking about Donald Trump or not is immaterial. There are people around him in positions of power who are preparing the ground for such an enterprise. So he has better strategy. He has more comprehensive plans that appear to me to be in motion already for the domestic situation than he has for overseas. And overseas, international relations, whatever you want to call it, national security, is going to eat his lunch before this is over. He's not only not going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, unless it's for disaster. He could very well get one for disaster. It's going to be out of the question because this man is going to have started a mess internationally that no one can take care of in the next decade or so. It's that bad. And all these people, a lot of my cohorts, a lot of my colleagues in places like the Eisenhower Media Network, Veterans for Intelligence Professionals, veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, VIPs, other organizations like that, are desperately trying to cling to Trump, desperately trying to say that he is a peacemaker, that he is against war, that all we're seeing is confusion because that's what he wants until he can shape his world the way he wants to shape it. If they're really down in the dumps that day, they'll say he'll do it for the Nobel Peace Prize, if nothing else, because that's what he wants. I think he's creating disaster. I think they've put their hopes and their faith in a chimera. I think he's creating disaster. And I think we're going to see that. I think we're going to see it economically and domestically, and I think we're going to see it internationally. And nothing gives me more vivid proof of that than his diametrically opposed approach, if you're talking about Ukraine as the main approach, in Gaza. That tells me what Donald Trump is really all about. And that is unconscionable. It is despicable. It is turning the world against the United States. It is putting very great distance between us and any kind of resurrection of the empire, if you will, giving more credibility, more ammunition, more substance to everything the opposition stands for. The opposition, Nima, now being some 70% of the world. And that's the 70% with the most money, too. That's the 70% without the colossal debt we have. That's the 70% that is going to comprise the future. And we're making that 70% day by day consider us as being the greatest threat to their future on the face of the earth. That's the way they look at us. What do you do with someone like that? Well, you try to get rid of them. You gang up, you collect your power, and you try to get rid of them. The problem there that you know well, I hope, is that we have nuclear weapons.
Actually, the outcome, you look at the meeting, I don't know if you saw the report about the meeting between the foreign minister of China going to India. Donald Trump is bringing these two countries together like never before. We haven't seen this before. They're getting to the next level, the relationship, because India, after all, is somehow, with the tariffs on them to pressure on Russia, they've learned that they can be sacrificed. They can be. It's enormous. The change that is coming to the mind of Indian government is enormous.
There's a principle of international relations that I found in a book by Fred Hartman. Fred was a real prolific. I think there's 6 or 7 editions to that book. He was so conscious of having to update this or update that. There was a major text at the Naval War College back in the early 80s. One of his principles of the relations of nations, I love that phrase. He doesn't call it international relations. He calls it the relations of nations. That's the name of the book, because that's what we're talking about, the relations of nations. And one of his principles is called the conservation of enemies. And very simply stated, it means that no country, no sane country, should ever court more enemies than it can handle at any one time. Think about that in terms of the American empire today. Think about that in terms of Bibi Netanyahu and Jerusalem. Is there anyone in the Levant that cares about Israel now, that wouldn't be better off and feel happier if Israel blew up tomorrow morning?
I want to talk about Israel, but before going there, Larry, here is what Macron said about the meeting they had with Donald Trump.
Is to be sure that this deal is not detrimental to Ukraine and Europe. And all of us, we want a deal and we want a peace deal. But we want to make sure that this peace, and so this deal, will be something which will allow the Ukrainians to recover the country and live in peace, to be sure the day after this peace deal that they will have sufficient deterrence power not to be attacked again, and to be sure for the Europeans that they will live in peace and security. So this is the nature of the peace, which will be now the core of our work. But I think this is a great news, and indeed your president is very confident about his capacity to get this deal done with President Putin, and it's great.
I don't see Vladimir Putin agreeing on anything that Macron just said.
You're absolutely right. He learned a new word, I think. Deal. He's not talking about diplomacy or national security or anything else. Deal. He's learned just like they all fled to Washington immediately. They all know now. You got to kiss his hand. You got to bow and scrape. To get even Zelensky changed his clothes. So yeah, crazy remarks, really. I mean, I hope he doesn't mean a single one of them because they just don't make any sense. Ukraine restored to any kind of military prowess whatsoever is a continued threat to Russia. Ukraine with any kind of NATO presence around it in a significant way is a threat to Russia. Ukraine with any future that suggests anything other than pure and utter neutrality, which incidentally, I went back and checked a couple of papers I wrote many, many moons ago. And my suggestion in the first paper was I used this phrase, a studied neutrality, by which I meant a very carefully shaped, formed, pursued, educated, and sensible neutrality was the only future for Ukraine. This was before all this brouhaha started. And then I wrote a second one where I said neutrality is the only answer to Ukraine's position. That wasn't what Macron was talking about. He was talking about a veiled association with, scuttling up to NATO. And the peace agreement would be one that would reestablish Ukraine as not just a rump state that's bled to death now, but a state that is resurrected and a state that, again, presents a threat to Moscow, which is NATO's long-term intention. He's crazy. He's crazy. He'll be gone. He'll be gone. Macron is a dead man walking. Merz is a dead man walking. Macron is a dead man walking. Starmer's a dead man walking. I'm convinced, we just had this is not connected at all, but I'm going to mention it. It seems to be something that happens in Finland every now and then. We just had a member of parliament in Finland apparently commit suicide. I'd love to go in and check his notes and see if, maybe he was coming around to understand what a tragic mistake his country had made, to abandon all that long history of getting along with or standing up to, if necessary, in a certain way, the Winter War, Russia, the big giant that abuts them. And now all of a sudden his country's gone mad. I might commit suicide too if I was living in that kind of situation and had to deal with those parliamentarians every day who did this, all bought and paid for by the CIA through weaponized democracy, weaponized NGOs, weaponized quaogs, weaponized everything that we could weaponize to change the governments in Europe to be favorable of NATO membership. And cemented by making Russia, after the SMO started, look like the big bugaboo that made sure they were right. We did all this. We did all this, Nima. I was there.
What's so funny that Finland has its prime minister is not president, it's prime minister of Finland. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe. Yeah, I think there's if I remember right, there's a president, and that's kind of pro forma, and there's a prime minister, and that's kind of, I believe. I may be confusing it, but I think that's the way it is. I met with members of the Finnish military in Liechtenstein back in about 2010 or so, and I was very impressed with those guys. They were part and parcel to the negotiations we were having there. They were over Iran at that time, but the Finns batted well above their weight, and to a man. And there was one woman there, but most of the military were men, and they were various ranks: lieutenant colonels, colonels, brigadier generals. They thought their policy was the best thing that had ever come down the pike. Their policy of neutrality. One of them had actually written the definitive Finnish book on the war, the Winter War, that they had to sacrifice some of their territory to achieve the end result. But they basically stood up to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I think there is a lot to be learned from Austria and the situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Doug McGregor talks about that. John Mearsheimer talks about that. I didn't know what Doug brought up the other day, which is a very important point. The Russians left a Russian principle in the Austrian hierarchy to monitor the situation And as Doug said, I think it was Doug said this, he had a great life. He lived in Vienna instead of in the Soviet Union. Had a very difficult time in the Soviet Union. But he was there to make sure the arrangements that had been put in place worked. Would that work for Ukraine? Probably, if anybody give it a break. You have to get rid of Zelensky. But it probably would work. It's part of a solution that I think would work, the so-called Austrian solution.
I really feel it's so difficult to get something in Ukraine with Zelensky being in power.
I think he's got to go. He's got to go. I think he's got to go. And I didn't realize how much he's controlled by the Azov types, the Nazi types, the really hard right wing, the ones I'm always ranting about, the ones I had to deal with when I was dealing with Ukraine in 2002, 3, and 4. If he's that captured by them, if they determine his fate, I'd say his fate is a bullet in the head eventually, because he's going to have to do something here. And when he does it, they're going to be so angry with him, they're going to take him out. I thought it'd be the other way around. I thought it'd be those Ukrainians who had a brain, saw the fate coming at them, and wanted some kind of modus vivendi with Russia, and they would vote him out or get him out or maybe take him out. But this group that I'm being told is the real power behind him, standing in the deep state position, if you will, in Kyiv, they'll kill him.
Carl, I don't know if you saw the meeting, the pictures of the meeting Donald Trump had with Europeans. They were somehow looking at the picture, long way that the European leaders has come, they've come to reach this moment. It's somehow amazing looking at the picture and the way that Donald Trump is somehow trying to talk. You look at their face and nobody's happy about the situation.
He's the professor and they're his seminar.
It's unbelievable. I don't know why does Europe do this to itself. And it's
good question. Good question. I mentioned to Jamal this morning, I think it was Jamal. I've done so many now, Nima, I can't keep up with them. I'm rereading John le Carré's the Tailor of Panama. You know that book? And I'm getting to the middle section of it where there's a description.
I've heard of it. I didn't read it. Yeah.
Well, there's a description of this British MI6 agent being hired in the beginning by MI6. And the guy is telling him he's been through the training. He's been through all the training, and now he's getting sort of his indoctrination briefing. And they get a special guy to do that. And it's not Smiley, it's somebody else. And this guy's telling him his first posting is going to be Panama. And Osnard looks at the guy, looks at this guy, and he says, Panama? Why am I going to? I know I speak Spanish fluently, but why am I going to Panama? And this guy just wonderfully gives him the reason. He says, in essence, I wish I could remember it exactly, but he says, in essence, you're going to Panama because those cousins over there, those Americans who've never learned anything about great power and how to manage it, like we did, they have given up the canal, one of the most strategic places in the world. You're going to Panama to foment the rebellion that will cause them to have to come back and take it over again. That is a vivid description by Carré of what the MI6 is all about. And now the CIA, Mossad, and others. You know, the Americans have screwed up. Let's go fix it. And we'll fix it by, undermining
the same trap.
Yeah. I read it and I said, man, I wish someone could just publish this on the top page, New York Times, Washington Post, whatever. This is how perfidious Albion deals with us. And it's the same thing happening today, whether you're talking Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, it's just the same thing. These freaking Mossad, CIA, MI6 are running the freaking West.
Larry, when it comes to Israel, we had over 1 million of people coming on the streets in Tel Aviv protesting against the government in Israel. How do you see the situation of Netanyahu? Whenever I see this sort of news coming out of Israel, I feel that something big gonna come out because Netanyahu has to do something to some distract people from what's going on in country and his position. He has to save. He has to survive. What's your take on that?
I think his way of surviving is going to be a war with Iran. I think Trita Parsi is right. I almost think it's inevitable. And he's got the buffoon in Washington to go along with that. I go back to my experience with George H.W. Bush, which was as vivid as my experience with George W. Bush, because every time Powell would go to, as chairman, would go to a National Security Council meeting or a deputies meeting or a principals meeting or whatever, he'd come back and debrief me. And I felt like in that sense, because I found his debriefings very accurate. I'll give you an example. One time he came back and he said, "We just prevented a war." I wasn't aware of any war that we were preventing at that particular moment. He said, smiling, looking at me. He'd just come back from a National Security Council meeting with H.W. Bush, Brent Scowcroft, and the crew, the group of 8, we called them. Well, Cory Aquino called on the telephone, and she says to me, I've got a battalion about to take over my government. Is there something you can do? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, Madam President. Went to the president, got permission, flew 2 heavily loaded F-4s at that time over the barracks of this battalion. I mean, loaded with bombs and rockets and everything else, 3 or 4 times. And they went back to barracks and the coup was put down. The president of the Philippines called and said, "Thank you very much." And he was telling me about that. All happened in about a 6-hour period. No one ever picked up on it. Papers never got it. Why would you want that to get out there? I mean, you did what you had to do and it worked. And you saved the president of, possibly saved the president of the Philippines, because the Philippines had a tendency to kill the people they want to go after. I mean, they would have killed Marcos. They were getting ready to kill Marcos when we plucked him out and took him to Hawaii. I'll never forget George Shultz coming to the tarmac at Pearl in Hawaii and saying essentially to the brigadier general who had brought Marcos to Hawaii, brought him out of the Philippines to Hawaii, "You screwed up, man. What you did, you really screwed." And the general just, said to him very calmly, Schultz was a big, tall guy, former Marine, said to him very calmly, "You would have had a bloodbath in the Philippines if I hadn't done it." And the admiral there jumped in and said the same thing, and Schultz just kind of retreated. He just kind of shrunk. That's the kind of thing that was happening at that time with H.W. Bush. Many things were taken care of, but they were taken care of because he was brilliant. He was brilliant at getting on the telephone and talking to people. Mitterrand, Kohl, doing diplomacy by the telephone, if you will. 2-3 hour telephone calls. We don't have that now. We don't have that at all. We don't have anybody who knows how to do diplomacy. Not Rubio, not Hegseth, not Trump, not Witkoff, not anybody in the administration, not Kellogg. Oh, I love seeing Kellogg over there. I didn't like to see him in the Oval Office, but he was over there behind everybody else. Done more damage than good in the whole thing, as have many generals in the U.S. Army. The old farts who should go away, pardon my French. But that's how badly we are working in the world today. We have no diplomats. We have no one who understands power. No one who understands how to wield power without bombs, bullets, bayonets, and sanctions. We just don't. And certainly not our president. Real estate deal experience? That's not experience for what George H.W. Bush did so splendidly. Now, A lot of people say to me after this podcast, probably, "Oh, George H.W. Bush was a terrible guy." Blah, blah, blah. Okay, he did run a lot of nefarious operations as Ronald Reagan's vice president. He did do a lot of things in the intelligence community because he'd been in it his whole life. But by and large, he left a country intact, power intact, and friends and allies intact. Can you say that for anybody since that? No, we can't. We're just running wild in the world.
You mentioned Larry Soros, and here is what he said. It's an old video clip, but it shows how deep these people were somehow preparing Ukraine to the moment to attack, to somehow preparing to go against Russia. Here is what he said.
Well, I thought we were on Gaza.
Yeah. We're gonna, because you've mentioned Soros.
Yeah.
I remember of the video. I want to show it to you to see your take on that.
Okay.
Pleasure to have you on.
Same here.
First, on Ukraine, one of the things that many people recognized about you was that you, during the revolutions of 1989, funded a lot of dissident activity, civil society groups in Eastern Europe, in Poland, the Czech Republic. Are you doing similar things in Ukraine?
Well, I set up a foundation in Ukraine before Ukraine became independent of Russia. And the foundation has been functioning ever since. And it played an important part in events now.
Do you think Ukraine will be able to assert a kind of independence from Russia and an alignment with the West, not a specific alignment as in NATO, but a kind of orientation toward the West, or will the Russians always stop them?
No, Putin will try to destabilize Ukraine. The foundation has been functioning ever since, and it played an important part in events now.
I got news for him. Ukraine destabilized Ukraine, not Russia. And it's so clear, it's so crystal clear if you examine the record, that one wonders at the utter imbecility, stupidity, or crass disregard for the truth that exists within the nomenclatura of the empire and Europe, because they should know this by now, if for no other reason than Lavrov and Putin have been jamming it into their heads since about 2014. But, you know, we have, I've told you many times, we have a different agenda, and that agenda is to push at China any way we possibly can. And one of the ways we think is most effective is via Russia, via Moscow.
Yeah. Larry, you've mentioned the case of Gaza, and I've learned here from you that Marco Rubio is trying to avoid, to not let these people from Gaza come into the United States to do their operations, that somehow the surgery they have, there's something in the medical and process that they need to do in the United States. What sort of logic do they have? What are they trying to say about these Gazans? Or they see them as a threat coming to the United States? They make some sort of problem for the United States? So what's the logic behind it?
I'm sure Netanyahu, not Netanyahu, but I'm sure Rubio, Netanyahu too, Rubio would make that kind of argument if he had to. Remember, he's the famous guy for the national security threat argument. You know, Peter Rabbit is a threat if it looks like a terrorist. But I think the real reason is because they don't want any visibility of the true situation in Gaza and on the West Bank too, in America. They are losing the propaganda war. Bibi's losing it increasingly in Israel. He's already lost it in the wider Levant. But he's starting to lose it in the United States. And every percentage point that is carved off the Israeli lobby's advantage over everybody else is something that is a knife in Bibi's heart. And so anything, no matter how small, how cruel, how hideous, he's willing to do, and Rubio is willing to follow his dictates in order to keep the United States out of the picture. It's been horribly successful, Nima. I go to coffee shops and talk to people just off the cuff, and they haven't a clue what's going on. They will say things like, oh, have you seen those pictures that are coming out of Gaza? Have you seen this or that? Is it really true? What do you mean, is it really true? My God, it's been coming across repeatedly, if you care to look. Oh, well, why do you think it's happening? Well, it's happening partly because you're empowering it. They don't make that connection, but more and more people are making that connection. I think we're seeing almost a sea change in some quarters in America that I never thought would change. And I think AIPAC, the Jewish lobby, as Mearsheimer and Walt like to call it, and that influence that people think is the real reason for our doing what we're doing. You know, my view is we're using Israel, not Israel using us. But that connection that makes that so facilitated is disappearing. And the charge of anti-Semitism, and this is not necessarily a positive thing, they've done it to themselves. Anti-Semitism is not working very well anymore. And Netanyahu's actions are creating real anti-Semites, which are going to be a problem in the future, as they've always been a problem. And it's all a negative situation for Israel, but we're helping to magnify and extend and try to make more profound that negative situation. And we're doing it all in the name of the disturbance we're creating in the Levant, because we think that's necessary. And what's the last final chapter of that disturbance? Iran. I think that's why Treater's right. I think Netanyahu is going to start it up again.
I don't know if you saw in the news that Iran and Armenia will establish the Persian Gulf Black Sea corridor. And they want to make this corridor to connect Iran to Russia.
To the Caucasus and above.
Yeah,
Yeah. Smart move. It's an old route, and it's a cheaper route because it's across the land rather than at sea. It avoids the United States Navy, which I'm sure is a consideration. Just as one consideration before was to avoid the Portuguese and then ultimately the British. And, you know, sea was dangerous from time to time, and it was a lot cheaper to do it by land too. So that's a good initiative. Another thing I heard, I'm not sure of this, but I'm fairly confident that at least part of it is accurate. Both the Russians and the Chinese have used the routes that China essentially developed to refurbish Iran considerably, and not just refurbish, you know, replace stores that were shot up in the 12-day war, but also give them the latest gear and equipment in quantity. So if they resume a conflict, I'll predict right now that not a single Israeli jet will fly over Iranian airspace and survive. I don't know that this is all accurate, but I have a suspicion that it is. You know, I'm not on the ground in Iran watching Russian S-400s be offloaded or whatever, but
the only thing that comes to my mind, in my opinion, Netanyahu, if decides to attack Iran, it's a total suicide for Israel. It's nothing more than less than that.
I think you're right. And I think if we go in, even if we go in with just air power and make the Iranians so mad that they strike back, and I think we would if we massively struck Iran with air power out of Al Udeid, out of King Khalid, off of carriers and everything else. If we did that, we'd make them so angry they would strike back. and we're pretty weak over there in terms of their striking back. We'd be in that war, fully in it, and eventually we'd have to put troops on the ground. That's the end of the empire. That is Syracuse to Athens. Iran is to the American empire. Syracuse didn't bring Athens down, but it began the inevitable collapse of the Athenian empire. And interestingly, that was kind of caused by a couple of guys who were really nasty military people for Athens and who got them sucked into that war and eventually started the unraveling of the Athenian empire, the Peloponnesian League and all that went along with it. That's going to happen with us inevitably, but it doesn't have to be tomorrow. But if we go to war with Iran in a significant way, it'll be tomorrow.
Iran somehow historically has been the graveyard of empires, in my opinion.
That's Afghanistan's title.
Yeah, that's
it's it from a historical point of view, an imperial history point of view. As I've said many times before, it's inevitable. Mearsheimer said, John and I had an argument up in New York when we were forming the Quincy Institute. John said war with China was inevitable, and I said, no, it doesn't have to be at all, unless we're just brain dead and stupid. And then, his contention was, my theory of realism says rising power, sinking power, war. And I said, that's too cold. That's too cold. Maybe John's right. Maybe it is inevitable. But if it's inevitable, it's because we've got idiots running the empire. China doesn't want a war. China doesn't want a war at all. They just want to beat the hell out of us otherwise. And they are. Thank you very much. Have you heard some of the latest statistics? This is pretty stunning for me to look at. I just got them yesterday. The People's Republic of China has hypersonic missiles of a quality that surpass even the Russians. Okay, goodbye, aircraft carriers. There's 90% of China's oil last year came by ship. We didn't do anything about it. Sanctions busting. 60% of 60% of the rare earth coming, I can't read my own handwriting. 60% of rare earth metals that are so desperately needed by the Pentagon and others come from China. But that's not the real factor. The real factor is 90% of the finished product with rare earth comes from China. 90%. 7 out of 10 electric vehicles, EVs, trucks, passenger cars, and so forth, globally, 7 out of 10 globally are made in China. The best ones are made in China. The PRC, China, has 1 million charging stations. The US has 1/60th of that. China spent $38 billion last year exploring for oil. ExxonMobil and Chevron together spent 1/60th of that. These are stats that China is the number one economic power in the world. They are the number one power. And they're just getting more so and more so every day that goes by. But they don't want war. They do not want war. It's kind of like the deal in Ukraine, only that's a microcosm of it. China doesn't want war because it's winning. And if it were to go to war, it would be set back. It would be set back, and we might go nuclear, and that would be a huge setback. So China's got smart leaders. They've got smart leaders. And I'm increasingly of a mind that Modi is turning out to be, despite his persecution of the Muslims in his country, he's turning out to be a pretty smart leader too.
I think China is unbelievable. You look at the United States, just Ukraine, Middle East, and they want to compete with China. So Well,
I want to go to the UN General Assembly and suggest to them, the UN, that they move to Shanghai. Bullet trains, get around all over the country comfortably. UN diplomats like comfort. You know, Shanghai would be a much better place. China could replace the United States in terms of its dues, and we could kick the United States out of the UN. If it didn't like it, we'd kick them out, kick Israel out with them, kick Israel out first. Of course, pie in the sky, but we don't have imagination in the world. We don't have courage in the world. But move the United Nations to Shanghai. Get it out of New York. Move it there. Make a point. Make a point. Enforce international law. Tell the United States to go to hell. You know, enforce international law. Get other countries on board. It shouldn't be that hard now, other than Europe and the United States. You know, we are, at best, we are 1/5 of the world. And the other 4/5 detests us. From Brazil to Delhi, to Beijing, to Moscow, they detest us. And we are increasingly making some of our staunchest allies, like Seoul and Tokyo, detest us.
Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us today.
The voice of doom. Well, you're going to have
You're
to
the
move.
voice of sanity.
Hey, you're going to have to move aside
Yes.
of it. I'm going to come down there and live with you for my last year. I told somebody yesterday, I said, you know, they're 82. I said, isn't it just excruciatingly painful to have lived 80 some odd years and to see the Furies destroying your country at those late years? And he said, damn straight it is.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Great pleasure, Larry, as always.
Take care.
See you soon.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.